Share a few reflections of my own on the cross with you. And I want to suggest this evening that, in a sense, we're presented with three different crosses over the period of the Easter weekend, from Friday to Sunday. Three different crosses, three different images, three different messages that we should take. And I want to try and illustrate it here. You don't have to be able to see here all the time, but at least just get a glance every now and then if you're sitting near the back. And so the first cross that we encounter on Easter is the Good Friday cross, the cross on which Christ was crucified. But I always have a problem with this word Good Friday. There's really nothing good about what happened on that Friday.
But it's also Bad Friday. Mm-hmm. It used to be called Bad Friday.
Well, that would be much better, I think. I think if we can think of Good Friday as Good Friday, it is only in retrospect. It's only after Easter, after the resurrection, that we can look back and we can see what is good on Friday. But in the Friday itself, I think of it as Dark Friday. Because that, I think, is the darkest day in the history of the universe, that day on which Christ was crucified. It's the day on which humanity took the greatest, most beautiful gift that had been given to us, and we exterminated it. We took the precious life of God's only begotten Son, and we nailed him to a cross. Every ugliness of humanity, the worst of humanity that we can imagine, is what would put Jesus on the cross on that Friday, that dark, dark Friday. Really, it is the sins of humanity that put him there. It was the hatred of people, it was jealousy, it was issues of power, it was issues of status and in-groups and out-groups. Those are the kinds of things that put Jesus on the cross that day 2,000 years ago. It's very easy sometimes for us to think about those people back then in those days who crucified him as if it's something unrelated to us. And even though it's true that none of us were there on that day, none of us were standing in that crowd shouting, "Crucify, crucify," none of us nailed the nails into his hands. It is the collective sins of the whole of humanity that led to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, including your sin and my sin. We all have to take kind of co-ownership and co-responsibility for that crucifixion, for the death of Jesus. Because each time that we sin, each time that we turn away from God, that helped put Jesus there. And so it is as if we've crucified him ourselves. It's shocking to think that we would put God on a cross and murder him, isn't it? When the idea is almost unimaginable that we should do that. And I think when we read about Jesus' anguish on the cross, what we're reading is not so much the physical anguish of nails in his hands and nails in his feet and so on, although that must have been terrible. But it was the experience of this profound hatred of humanity towards him. A man who embodied love, like we said last week. And so isn't it remarkable that as Jesus hangs on the cross and experiences all of this, that the words that we hear come out of his mouth are words of love? Isn't that remarkable? That as he is being crucified, he looks down at those very people who crucify him and he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The first response is to pardon and to set free those who did the physical crucifixion. That he looks down and he sees his mother and he sees his best friend John and he says, "Woman, here is your son. And John, here is your mother." And he recognizes two people who are bereft and in need and grieving the loss of himself. And he connects them. And he forms a new family, a new community, that thing that God did right in the very beginning when he created Adam and Eve, two people in relationship. Jesus dies from the cross as he dies. That there's that encounter between the two criminals on either side of him. And he says to the one who says, "Remember me," he says, "This very day you will be with me in paradise." He offers salvation and hope as his own life ebbs away. Jesus does that because he is the embodiment of love. He is God's love in human flesh. It is so woven into the fabric of his being that even as he is being poured onto with human sin and anger, he expresses love. That's the first cross. That's the Dark Friday cross, the day on which Christ died. And he does. And Joseph lays him in a tomb. And it's the Sabbath evening, and everybody goes home. Saturday is the Sabbath. Jesus' body lies in the tomb. It's cold and dead. There's no life there. The women are all at home, because that's where you are on the Sabbath. You stay home. You may not work, you may not go anywhere. The disciples are all at home or somewhere. Can you imagine where their state of mind must be? Absolute shock. The turmoil, the devastation. That the Messiah that they followed, who they thought was going to save them and redeem and liberate them from the oppression of Rome and lead a new spiritual revival, is now dead. So we call the Saturday cross the silent Saturday cross. It is a day of silence because nothing can happen on that day. No one can do anything about what happened on Friday. They are in silence, in shock. They're covered. The cross in a way is hidden. Everybody's at home and the doors are closed and no one can go out and no one can do anything except to think. It's a day when we're silent and we think. It's a day when we're silent and we're shocked. I've often reflected and wondered what was happening in God on Saturday. What was going on in the mind and the heart of God on Saturday? We try and put ourselves into God's shoes, so to speak. Your only beloved Son, your greatest joy and love, has been killed, murdered, brutally murdered. What would you be feeling? Shock and devastation, grief, anger, confusion. Remember how we've said in the first week when we talked about the Trinity that God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit had existed from before time, for eternity, in perfect, intimate fellowship. Last week when we reflected on the Incarnation, we talked about how the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, emptied himself out in the kenosis, made himself small in order to enter humanity and become one of us. But now he has a whole new experience in the heart of God. It is the experience of death. That the second person of the Trinity has died. It really is unimaginable. Jesus tells us a parable in Mark chapter 12. We also read it in Matthew and Luke. It's one of the parables that comes up in all the three synoptic gospels, called the parable of the tenants. Do you know that one? Mm-hmm. It's the parable that says that there was a wealthy landowner who built a beautiful vineyard, and he loved it and cared for it, and he built a wall around it. It's like a garden. It was a precious thing. And then he had to go away, and so he hired some tenants, rented the land out to them to take care of while he was away. And they didn't want to pay the rent. So he sent a servant to go and claim the rent. And they didn't feel like paying the rent, so they beat him and they chased him away. So he sent another servant. And this one they treated shamefully. Didn't pay the money. The next one, they beat and murdered. And the owner kept sending more servants in the hope that they would listen to him. And they didn't. They treated each one like before. Until eventually he thought, let me send my only son, my one and only, my beloved. Maybe they will listen to him. And so he sends his son in hope and expectation that they will respect and listen to this expression of his love, of his heart. But of course they kill him. What does Jesus tell us the landowner did? He went and he killed all the tenants because he was so enraged, he was so grieved, he was so betrayed, so hurt. He killed the tenants. He gave the vineyard away to other people. Isn't that story so similar to the story of Jesus' life? The parallel is remarkable, up until the point of death. Here's what I think God was experiencing on Easter, on that silent Saturday. He was grappling with his own rage and grief and a desire to destroy. We had wounded God in the most profound way that we possibly could. You take the worst thing that we can imagine anybody doing, and then we multiply it by 1 billion. That's kind of what it is that we did. And God is outraged and wounded and grieved and wants to destroy, grapples with how does he respond. Silent Saturday for me has become a day of staying at home, and it's something I want to encourage you to do. That Saturday, Holy Saturday, is a day when we should stay at home, that we should be silent, that we should wait and watch to see what God does. Not a day for going out, not for shopping, not for having a bride, not for doing something fun. A day for being at home and being quiet. It is that day when the future of the world hangs in balance. Is he going to come and destroy the vineyard, or will something else happen? We wait on God for that decision. It's the second cross, Silent Saturday cross. We come to Sunday. We discover what God has decided. Because the women have prepared the herbs and the spices, and the ointments and the bandages to go and prepare Jesus' body properly for burial. And when they get to the tomb, of course we know, they find that it's open and empty. And Jesus is not there anymore. And they discover what God's decision was. They discover how God resolved this crisis in the life of God when we killed the Son. And that is that God chooses not to destroy, but to forgive. And how do we know that? We know that because the one that we killed is the one who comes back. That the Son of God whom we murdered returns to us. That God who gifted us with him in the first place returns Jesus to us. Jesus' return to us, his resurrection, is the sign of God's forgiveness. God would never return him to us if he wasn't going to forgive us, would he? It is the demonstration that God forgives. And so we think of that Sunday, this third cross, this one that lies down. If I were allowed to, Sunday, I'd stand on it and break it. Because that's what he does. He shatters the cross. It is the resurrection cross. It is a different kind of cross. It is broken and destroyed. God grapples between his rage and his love. And we've talked about this several times over the last few weeks and said that what is central in God, what is at the core of God is his love. And so in this struggle within the heart of God, he chooses love, not hate. He chooses life, not death. He chooses peace instead of conflict. He chooses forgiveness instead of retribution. Now, we're not sure how God got to that point. What we do know is that it took him 2 days to get there. This was not an easy, snap decision for God. Oh, well, he loves us and so he'll forgive us. This was a choice that God agonized over through Holy Saturday. Perhaps it was something like this. We remember the story of Abraham bargaining with God for the survival of Sodom and Gomorrah. And maybe the argument in God's head went something like this. What if there are 1 billion righteous people on earth? Would you forgive them then? And God says, I guess if there are 1 billion righteous people, maybe I would. And then somebody says, what if there were 1,000? Would you forgive them then? And God says, maybe for 1,000. And what about 100? And what about 10? What about 1? What if there was 1 righteous person on earth? Would you forgive them? And God says, yes, perhaps for 1 righteous person, I could forgive. And then Jesus says, but I am that righteous person. I am that sinless person, that human being who stands in a right relationship with you. And so save them, forgive them for me, because I am that one. Perhaps that's what happened. Or perhaps God looked at each of you. Perhaps God looked at me and said, as much as he hates what we have done, as much as it grieves and hurts him and makes him angry, he can't help but love you. He just can't help himself. Can't help but look at you and love you, despite everything. And therefore he chooses to forgive. It is the greatest gift to be set free from that sin. If we think of the crucifixion of Jesus, it is the greatest sin that humanity could commit. On Monday, we commemorated the genocide in Rwanda. That was a terrible crime against humanity. Several weeks ago, we remembered Auschwitz, actually the Holocaust. And that was a terrible crime against humanity. But the murder of Jesus Christ is greater than all of those. And so the forgiveness that is required to forgive that is profoundly great. And in a sense, every other sin that you and I commit gets caught up in that great act of forgiveness. By forgiving that profound and central sin, God forgives all sin. It's all pulled together by the gravity of this profound act of forgiveness. And so Paul says in Romans 8, therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And Jesus himself says to the woman who was caught in adultery, neither do I condemn you. And that's the third cross, the resurrection cross. And so here's what I invite us to continue to do as we journey through these last days of Lent and towards Easter, is to reflect on these different crosses and the different meanings that they can have for us at different times during the process. And to see both how we contributed to the death of the Son of God, but also to see the great love of God that is revealed through that whole process, that culminates on Easter Sunday in the resurrection, which is the sign of divine forgiveness for humanity.